Welcome back. I'm Michael Bull, and this is the Commercial Real Estate Show. Our topic today is, oops, I should have covered that in the lease. My guest is Laura Hall. She's a partner with Sheley Hall Williams Law Firm. Laura, thanks for being with us and
glad to be here.
Talking to us about leases today and some of the things that are the gotchas that you really want to watch out for. And one of those things, I think, whether you're a landlord or a tenant, maybe more so if you're a tenant, but a landlord or tenant, it's operating expenses, right? And controlling those.
Right. It is. If you're a tenant, you certainly want a cap on any kind of increases in controllable operating expenses. And as with landlords, they don't like them, even though I feel like most landlords are comfortable in their historical and sort of future operating expense increases. So we do see a lot of tenants successfully negotiating, certainly in the LOI stage, a cap on controllable operating expenses. We see those range from 4%, 5% to up to 7 or 8%. Rarely do
annually.
Annually,
it doesn't seem like that much of a cap.
Yeah, well, exactly, but some.
You must be a landlord attorney.
Mostly, I do represent some tenants, but we see them on just controllables, and so depending on which side of the table you're sitting on is going to determine how you define what controllable operating expenses are.
Yeah. So for the business owner that's maybe listening, what are some of the basics, controllable expenses and non-controllable expenses that the landlord may be passing along to you that you're trying to cap?
And it's mainly a definition of non-controllables, and most tenants are going to want those to be taxes, insurance, utilities. Landlords are going to want to expand those. Owners are going to want to expand those to a lot of times security expenses, depending on where your building's located, the type of security you're required to provide. If you're in downtown Atlanta or midtown Buckhead, your security is more than likely going to be much more expansive and expensive. If you're out in suburban Atlanta, or not Atlanta, but a suburban market, your expenses are probably going to be a lot less. You may have a roving guard, and
that's
you don't really control those.
And it's a good point that it's non-controllable because if your tenants, for some reason at certain times, something's going on and they need more security, you need to give it to them.
You do, and if a specific tenant asks for that, then that's their expense. But if it's an expense for the building, a lot of times you don't control what those are. But you also want to intrude in the non-controllable bucket things like governmental expenses that are unforeseen, that now the government's requiring you to do some retrofit to your building. If it's capital in nature, more than likely you're not going to be able to pass it through. But if it's a non-capital expenditure, you do want the ability to pass that through and not be subject to a cap, because you don't really control, as we know, what the government's going to tell you to do. So there are different buckets and different expectations depending on what side you're on. If you're an owner, you also want to make sure those caps are cumulative and compounding so that the cap in and of itself can grow over time. And if you're a tenant, a big oops would be not to say it's just a 5% or 3% cap. That way, you know you can control and budget what your expense increases could potentially be any given year. So.
And what do you say if you're a landlord or you're representing a landlord and the tenant is trying to cap all the expenses, operating expenses, and the tenant says to you, look, we have to know what our rent's going to be. Our total occupancy cost needs to be in our budget to approve it and to know what if we can make it and pay your rent. What do you say to them?
Well, no. You would say no. I mean, there are some expenses you just really can't control increases on. So I think it's reasonable, and it's a very market kind of approach to take, is we'll cap the majority of them. Or if you're willing to negotiate something, you'll say it's a non-cumulative cap, so at least you have some control over that. Or we'll limit it just to taxes, insurance, and utilities. And so there is a small number of things that could potentially increase more than 5% or 3%. So.
And if you're a tenant and you run a business, you may say, well, I have a full service lease, and so it includes all their operating expenses, but you probably have an expense stop, right? Where it's expenses over a certain level the year the lease started, you are paying those. So you still have to pay attention to that.
Oh, absolutely. And most of the leases that I work on are full service with either a base year or an expense stop. And a base year just means that the first year of your lease typically is that number of operating expenses will be in your rent. And so you really don't start paying any kind of operating expenses till the following calendar year, and only to the extent that they've increased over that first year. So there is some sort of natural limitation on how much landlords will charge or can charge. And truthfully, it's also a marketing risk for landlords. If their expenses increase 5 to 10% a year, they're going to lose a lot of their tenants.
Right. Right. And then obviously it matters the size and credit that the tenant is bringing to the table, right?
Always. That's always a big factor.
Right.
Now, with operating expenses, you typically don't worry about that as much or look at that as much because, again, they're the expenses of the building, and everybody needs to pay their fair share.
Okay. What would be your number 3 item that, so we've talked about in the previous segment, guarantees.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've talked about operating expenses and control. What would be number 3 on the oops list?
The one thing that we always try to avoid or when we're drafting to be very careful are expansion rights. Those from a landlord's perspective can be a big gotcha because they're sometimes hard to, I won't say hard to, but they're another burden for the administration folks to keep up with all these various options that are being granted.
Right, and these options where a tenant leases space and they have an option for another floor or
Right.
space contiguous to them, right?
Right.
And now the new landlord, the new asset managers doesn't remember that lease,
Right.
and he's doing a new lease, right?
Right, that's exactly right, and you've got to make sure that you know exactly who's got rights to that floor, and whether it's a right of first offer, whether it's a right of first refusal, and they're very different animals, and depending on how you draft them. And you just got to make sure you don't miss one because once you build out space next to a tenant who actually had rights to that space, they'll come knocking.
Right, and I think it's you see it more so than maybe we did years ago. I've been in this business for a long time because tenants are a lot more concerned about flexibility today.
Absolutely.
Right, they'd love to be able to reduce the amount of space or increase the amount of space
Absolutely.
at their whim. Because they want the exact square footage. I know I have some tenants come and say, I want 20,122 square feet. I'm like, really?
That's exactly right. And tenants do that. And during the recession, we saw tenants, of course, it was a huge tenants market. And tenants were getting right of first refusals, right of first offer, expansion rights, contraction options, termination options. I mean, their special clauses were 5 and 6 and 7 pages long. You don't see that as much right now, but they do want to be able to control their growth, either up or down. So it's a very legitimate, thing that tenants want. It's just a question of how you are granting those. From a landlord's perspective, you don't like to give a lot of first refusal rights because then you've actually gone to the market, taken that space, you've got a deal already in play, and now you've got to go back and offer it to an existing tenant. So landlords really do stray away from those if they can.
So first right of offer would be safer for a landlord than
Absolutely.
the first right of refusal.
Right.
That way, when the space comes available, you're taking the tenant, hey, you want it?
Right.
If you don't, we're going to market.
Exactly. So you
Right.
don't have an active deal, out there with a tenant sitting and waiting, and now they've got to wait another 2 weeks before you've cleared those rights.
Yeah.
So
But a tip for a tenant is they want all those options to expand and
Absolutely.
renew their lease, but we're talking expansion now, that they can get.
Right.
Right? So, and a lot of tenants are going to really need them and want them. So what's your tip to a landlord that has a multi-tenant office building and they know they have some of these first right of refusals? How do they manage it?
Well, you have to have a really good database of what all these rights are that have been granted. We routinely do abstracts for landlords when they're buying buildings, and so it lays out all of these various options that are in the existing leases. They typically turn those over to their management group. They'll put together a spreadsheet database, and that's how they keep up with them.
Yeah.
And there's just a big checks and balances that you've got to make sure you're doing.
Well, that's smart because I think our listeners know that on retail properties, it's extremely important. There's so many things that can violate another lease, but I think sometimes you may think on an office deal, maybe you don't have to worry about it as much, but you can get into a problem area.
Absolutely.
Right.
And when you're drafting these, you want to make sure sort of a big oops that I've seen happen is with the right of first refusal, if a tenant has a right to, say, half a floor, but you've got a deal on the table for the full floor, you want to make sure your refusal right is very specific, that if you take that deal, you take all of that deal,
Right.
so that you're not then losing potentially a bigger and better deal to give a tenant that's, now granted, they're an existing tenant, they should have some sort of leverage, but you don't want to lose a bigger deal to give a half a floor to an existing tenant. So
Okay. All right. Well, good. Well, I think there's at least 100 items
Absolutely.
that can be gotchas in a lease. But we're going to talk about number 4 after this short break. So stay with us. I'm Michael Bull. This is the Commercial Real Estate Show. Stay with us. Hey there, thanks for checking out the Commercial Real Estate Show. Don't miss a video of special interest to you. Be sure to subscribe below. And if you appreciate the videos, be sure and thank our sponsors. There's a link to more information about them in the description. For more videos, podcasts, and articles, check out creshow.com.